The marble floors carried every sound as if the building itself were an instrument tuned for propaganda. Radios barked the same speech from every corner, words thudding against the walls like drums in a parade. Outside, the crowd roared, a living tide of certainty and flags. Inside, I moved slower, measured through the echo. Noise meant allegiance now, and silence, suspicion. At my desk, the decree for the new industrial expansion lay half-damp from the ink. 11 signatures marked the page, bold and black. One line, Minister for Finance, was blank. No explanation, no margin note, only a small absence that hummed louder than the speeches outside. I traced the empty space with my finger, as if contact could reveal motive. Every policy had its rhythm, but this pause, this silence felt deliberate. They called it efficiency. Factories unified, output doubled, dissent erased. Yet in the ledgers, numbers whispered the opposite story. Loans refinanced with loyalty, not solvency, contracts granted to cousins and comrades. The speeches promised a dawn, but the math suggested smoke. I wrote my calculations in pencil, not ink erasable, like safety. The corridor vibrated when the Reich anthem began. My colleagues stood straighter, some saluting, some pretending not to notice those who didn't. I kept my eyes on the paper. A signature missing in a sea of declarations might seem trivial, but in economics, silence costs. Without that line, the authorization lacked full legal force. It could be challenged later, quietly, surgically, if one survived long enough to need it. Someone laughed behind me, a sharp sound that didn't reach the eyes. "You work too hard, Herr Doctor. History's already written." I smiled because disagreement had a body count, but in my head, I counted seconds, not applause. Each minute of cheering outside meant another hour the markets went unmonitored. Noise could hide decay, for a while. When the anthem ended, the room didn't fall silent, it held its breath. Papers rustled, pens clicked, and the echo resumed. I slid the unsigned decree into my folder and closed it like a secret. Someday, that absence would speak louder than any order given today. For now, the city shouted victory, and I listened for what it wasn't saying. By winter, the noise had become policy. Orders arrived faster than paper could dry, each one signed by men who measured power not in balance sheets but in obedience. The new minister, young, sharp uniform, no financial training, dismissed 3 senior bankers before lunch and called it reform. "Loyalty," he said, "will outlast expertise." The room applauded. I kept my hands still. That week, I watched familiar names vanish from ledgers. The Rothschild affiliates, the old credit houses, the few who still asked about reserves, all removed, their accounts absorbed into the Reich's central vault. It looked decisive on paper, but I saw the arithmetic: no oversight, no external audits, no breaks. Control felt like safety to them, but it was blindness dressed as order. They wanted silence where questions used to live. I remember the night I began the memo. The office was empty except for the hum of the electric lamp and the faint smell of burned tobacco. On the first page I wrote, "Concentration of fiscal authority without market feedback guarantees collapse within a decade." It wasn't rebellion. It was arithmetic. I typed it clean, added supporting tables, currency circulation ratios, projected inflation curves, and signed it simply HD, Economics Division. Then I sealed it with the ministry stamp and slid it into an envelope. But I didn't send it. Not that night, not ever. Every courier was screened, every line item checked for deviation. Silence, I had learned, could protect you longer than reason. The envelope stayed in my desk, sealed and dated, an act of both caution and defiance. A quiet proof that I'd seen the crack forming before the foundation even set. They weren't monsters, most of them. They believed, sincerely, that devotion could replace design. The minister visited once, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate jacket as he spoke. "We need unity, not debate," he said. "Numbers are loyal if the people are." His confidence was almost gentle, the way a child believes a locked door keeps the storm away. I nodded, because arguing truth against faith never changes the forecast. The next morning, the markets shifted, small, invisible tremors. Currency held by neutral states began to slip, our gold reserves thinned under the weight of ambition. No one noticed but me, and even then, I said nothing. The sealed memo remained in my drawer, untouched, its silence heavier than ink. Someday, I thought, it might need to speak for me. By 1934, the silence had texture. You could feel it between the pages, ink pressed too hard, signatures bleeding through the paper, as if conviction could make the math behave. Meetings grew smaller, tighter. The new inner circle preferred whispering behind closed oak doors to open debate. They called it efficiency again, but what it meant was control of currency, of conversation, of air itself. I was still there, a polite observer with a ledger instead of a rifle. My office overlooked Wilhelmstrasse, where parades now replaced traffic. Every Friday, I recorded the flow of capital, Reichsbank issues, industrial allocations, foreign holdings. Each number came paired with its weapon: the steel works, the munitions, foundries, the aircraft consortiums, all swelling with sudden funding. Not stability, not infrastructure, just armament, dressed as recovery. On paper, it looked miraculous. 2 billion Reichsmarks allocated to reindustrialization, announced publicly as job creation. In truth, nearly 70% went straight into rearmament contracts buried under infrastructure expenditure. We used MIFO bills, special promissory notes issued through dummy corporations, to hide debt from international scrutiny. They carried 6-month maturities but were rolled over endlessly, like a man living on loans he'd never repay. It worked for a while. All illusions do. Factories that once made rail bolts now produced shell casings. Laborers were told they were rebuilding Germany's pride. In reality, they were mortgaging its future. I watched as shipments of raw copper and aluminum disappeared into coded inventories. Every transaction bore the smell of secrecy. We were no longer balancing books, we were rehearsing delusion. There were small frictions, the kind that only a bureaucrat notices. A delay in payment from the Reich Treasury, 14 days instead of 3. A missing endorsement on a loan renewal from the Bank of Danzig. When I asked, the clerk whispered, "Backlog," and glanced at the wall before speaking again. Even silence had become procedural. Sometimes I would hold the newest decree in my hands and feel the faint warmth of the ink, the way breath fogs glass. Paper and breath are two currencies now. I knew the numbers by touch. If the page weighed too light, it meant an omission; if too heavy, an addition concealed. The difference between solvency and spectacle was often a single sheet. At night, I recalculated totals by candlelight, erasing figures before dawn. The National Treasury wasn't a vault anymore, it was a clock. Each promissory bill ticked against the seconds we had left before exposure. They wanted an empire. I wanted a balance sheet that could stand its own weight. The silence around me deepened. It wasn't peace, it was compression, the kind that comes before structures fail. Even then, no one would speak it aloud. The ledgers were stacked like bricks, walling us in. And still, outside my window, the parades kept marching, loud enough to drown the sound of everything coming undone. The decree arrived with a crimson seal and no explanation, just another order to expand production efficiency across the occupied sectors. Efficiency had become a word for extraction, nothing more. I read it once, twice, then set it aside. My memo was still in the drawer beneath my desk, its edges soft from handling. I had written the truth in numbers, but truth had no currency here. So I made another decision, smaller but far sharper. If I couldn't stop the collapse, I would document it quietly, methodically, completely. Not resistance, but record-keeping. The first act was invisibility. I stopped asking questions in meetings, stopped correcting arithmetic that was designed to please, not inform. I signed attendance sheets but left no remarks. When reports were filed, I kept the duplicates, marking them with coded initials: E1 for economic falsification, S2 for strategic deceit. Each copy slipped into a second archive I created from recycled folios, gray folders that looked like routine storage to anyone glancing past. Visibility meant danger, obscurity meant time. The ministry's auditing cycle worked in my favor. Every requisition order took 6 to 8 weeks to reach review. That gap, the quiet between submission and scrutiny, was my shelter. I used it to rewrite versions of ledgers that mirrored the originals but corrected the lies. The forgeries looked identical, down to the watermark, only the arithmetic differed. When the real inspections came, they found perfection. When mine would one day be found, they'd find evidence. Each night, after the corridors emptied, I'd linger under the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The silence was dense, almost tangible. I could hear the paper breathe when I turned a page. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the window, just another civil servant, a ghost in plain sight. Yet even ghosts leave traces. I signed a few documents under alternate names. H. Dieter became H.D., Adler in one set, H. Den in another. 3 men with identical handwriting but no record of meeting. In a system obsessed with control, multiplicity was my camouflage. It wasn't courage, it was calculation. If discovery came, one false identity could be discarded while another survived. I told myself I wasn't lying, I was preserving an accurate future under false present names. Still, every falsified signature felt like a breath I wasn't sure I could release. Once, the minister paused by my desk, his gloves tucked neatly under one arm. "You've been quiet lately," he said, smiling without warmth. "Productive silence, I hope." I nodded, meeting his eyes for just a second too long. Silence again, my only language of safety. There's a point when silence stops being shield and starts sounding like complicity. I crossed it quietly, with ink and carbon copies. And in that stillness, I began to understand how easy it is for truth to suffocate under the weight of formality. Ever stayed silent so long that truth started sounding dangerous? Tell me below. The next requisition deadline was 14 days away. Enough time to vanish, on paper first, then in person, if I had to. The memo in my drawer stayed sealed, waiting for the moment it would no longer endanger the living. For now, I recorded, erased, and rewrote until even my own handwriting looked unfamiliar. The nights grew longer that spring, though the clocks never admitted it. I started measuring time not by days, but by the rhythm of the typewriter, the metallic percussion of secrecy. Each keystroke echoed down the corridor like a heartbeat too loud for the hour. Silence had turned mechanical. It no longer meant stillness, only the discipline of control. I worked from the archives 3 floors below the ministry's main offices, where dust muted even footsteps. By day, the ledgers waited in ordered stacks, official, immaculate, unassailable. By night, I brought them to life. 2 versions of every account, one for the Reich, one for the record. The false entries gleamed in fresh ink, shipments exaggerated, balances adjusted, payments delayed. In the mirror copies, I kept the math honest. Fabrication and fact lived side by side, like twin lungs sharing one breath. Every evening at 21, I sent a coded telegram through the Telegrafenamt, addressed to R. Adler, Zurich. The name belonged to no one, but the mailbox did. A Swiss accountant who owed me a favor from a time when currency, not ideology, decided loyalty. He received my documents through a neutral courier line that ran from Constance to Street Gallen. The fee for a sealed diplomatic pouch was 40 francs, payable in advance. The waiting time for return verification stamps averaged 10 days, weather permitting. Those 10 days felt like entire seasons, each one a wager that no inspector would ask why my office lights burned so late. The first pattern interrupt came without warning. A freight manifest disappeared between the archives and the rail office, a single folder listing metal shipments to the Ruhr foundries. Without it, the balance sheets collapsed into contradiction. I searched every drawer, every registry log, every misplaced envelope, nothing. So I did what I'd learned to do best, rebuild quietly. By hand, I reconstructed the numbers from peripheral receipts, cross-referencing with payment vouchers and telegram confirmations. Every digit had to agree with the fiction. By dawn, the manifest existed again, technically untraceable, statistically perfect. It wasn't the first lie I'd written to save the truth, but it was the one that taught me precision could be mercy. There was a strange calm in the deception. I discovered that patience could mimic loyalty if you slowed your movements enough. When superiors passed my desk, I greeted them with reports already stamped, errors already corrected. They saw diligence, I saw the narrowing corridor of their delusion. Once, the deputy minister complimented my consistency. "You never fall behind, Herr Doctor." I thanked him and thought of the 10-day lag between the Reich's paperwork and Switzerland's confirmation, a quiet gulf where freedom lived, if only on paper. On the 5th transmission cycle, the courier delayed my package for inspection at the border. I imagined the customs officer's fingers tracing the edge of the envelope, weighing its thickness, deciding whether one more sealed document was worth the trouble. He let it through. When the packet returned, the Swiss seal was faint but legible. I pressed my thumb to it like a pulse. Proof that silence still had circulation. Some nights I forgot what hour it was. The typewriter's steady rhythm became prayer: tap, space, shift, return. I'd pause only when the ribbon ink thinned, the letters fading like breath on glass. In those moments, I felt my own pulse slow to match the keys. If fear is noise, then strategy is quiet. I learned to move within that quiet, to let it hold me steady as the world above grew louder, more triumphant, more blind. By summer, the ledgers were complete, every false sum paired with its twin truth, every lie archived in duplicate. I locked them in separate cabinets under separate names, one visible, one invisible. Compliance, on paper. Defiance, in duplicate. The ministry slept soundly above me, convinced the numbers sang their anthem. I sat beneath, listening instead to the hum of the typewriter cooling in the dark, a machine that had learned to keep my secrets better than any friend could. Somewhere across the border, the courier prepared his next run, 10 days to proof, 10 days to breathe. And in that measured silence, I felt something shift, the faint, certain rhythm of control returning to my own hands. By 1942, the noise had reached its loudest pitch: marching bands, victory parades, headlines printed in ink thick enough to hide the cracks beneath. But numbers have no loyalty. They obey only balance, and balance was slipping. I saw it first in the requisition summaries. Figures that should have matched but didn't, freight totals that came up short, expenditures without corresponding receipts. To anyone else, they were minor discrepancies. To me, they were the pulse of something living beneath the surface, my own fingerprints, finally surfacing after years of deliberate quiet. The regime's auditors arrived without warning, 4 men in pressed uniforms, carrying leather binders and the smell of stress masked with cologne. They worked in pairs, reviewing wartime accounts line by line. The first day, they said nothing. The second, they started whispering. By the third, one of them requested a private word in the corridor. "These ledgers," he said, tapping the folder, "they balance too perfectly. No system does that." His tone was almost admiring. The truth was simple but invisible. Millions of Reichsmarks, meant for armament contracts, had been diverted through my network of duplicate ledgers into neutral accounts, Swiss, Swedish, even a few Dutch intermediaries listed under dormant industrial trusts. The money still existed, only unclaimed, waiting like a seed buried deep in cold soil. I hadn't stolen it. I'd preserved it, beyond the reach of the madness consuming its source. The inspection lasted 6 weeks. Every night, they locked the files in the ministry safe. Every morning, they emerged more drawn, more brittle. Control was their creed, but now control betrayed them. They couldn't admit the flaw without admitting fallibility. One auditor began to drink coffee so strong it stained his fingertips. Another developed a tremor in his left hand, trying to hide it under the table as he recalculated sums. Panic, disguised as discipline. They summoned me once to clarify methodology. The deputy minister sat across from me, jaw clenched, eyes red from lack of sleep. "These accounts," he said, "show inconsistencies with factory output reports. You were the signatory on several." His voice was steady but frayed around the edges. "Explain them." I opened the nearest ledger and pointed to the authorization columns. "Your predecessor required dual verification on industrial requisitions," I said. Many of these orders overlapped. Clerical errors were inevitable. I paused, letting the silence sit heavy between us. "Would you like me to correct them?" He hesitated because correction meant admission, and admission meant failure. "No," he said finally, "document them. Quietly." That word again, quietly. It gave me more power than any title ever could. Silence, once my shield, had become my weapon. Outside, rumors began to circulate. Someone was sabotaging internal accounts, bleeding the treasury dry. They spoke of treason and abstractions, an internal leak. A procedural weakness. Hitler's inner circle held emergency meetings that lasted past dawn. Each suspected the other, but none suspected the paper. The Reich had always feared voices, never ledgers. They didn't realize that truth could whisper through arithmetic. One morning, a courier from the Foreign Office delivered an envelope marked urgent. Inside was a photocopy, a faint carbon image of my old sealed memo, the one I'd never sent. My initials, my words, my warning. Concentration of fiscal authority without market feedback guarantees collapse within a decade. Only now, the header bore a foreign stamp: British Intelligence, Economic Division. I remember staring at it for a long time, tracing the outline of my own handwriting through the thin paper. Somehow, through the network of couriers and intermediaries, my memo had crossed the border, become evidence of what we were too afraid to admit. The silence I'd preserved had learned to speak without me. By the next week, the ministry was in controlled disarray. Meetings canceled, orders delayed, security increased at every archive. Inspectors demanded access to old files that no longer existed, because I'd rewritten them into ghosts. One colonel stormed through the halls, shouting that there would be no secrets in the new Reich. His boots echoed down the marble corridor, a sound more desperate than commanding. Still, I kept working, recalculating, adjusting, maintaining the illusion of obedience. The inspectors' reports grew vaguer, their conclusions thinner. They didn't know it yet, but the system was feeding on itself. Every attempt to tighten control only made the fissures wider. I'd always imagined the fall would sound like an explosion. Instead, it began with paperwork pages turning, signatures missing, silence spreading like a hairline fracture through glass. They still believed they owned the machinery, but I had learned the truth: influence isn't noise. It's the ability to decide which numbers live on the page, and which quietly disappear. The invisible knife was already in motion, cutting through the empire not with rebellion, but with precision. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself a thought both terrifying and electric. They couldn't trace it, not yet, not ever. My silence had become their undoing. The summons came at dawn, 2 officers at the door, polished boots reflecting the gray light. They didn't shout, didn't threaten. They simply said my name and handed me a paper stamped Geheime Staatspolizei. Even the paper smelled sterile, like fear that had been boiled clean. I asked if I might bring my briefcase. One of them nodded, the other watched my hands too closely to feel casual. They took me to Prinz Albrechtstrasse, where the walls were thicker than sound. The building had no scent of ink or oil like the ministry, only metal, sweat, and the faint sting of disinfectant. The silence inside wasn't empty. It was weighted, as if it had learned to listen. The first interrogation began at 8:17. The officer introduced himself as Kruger, mid-40s, hair cropped close, posture too careful for cruelty. He smiled in the way men do when they think kindness might loosen you faster than pain. "Your records are impeccable, Herr Doctor," he said. "Almost too impeccable. We like efficiency, but we like honesty more." I asked if there was a question in that. He didn't answer, just placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of my ledgers, the sanctioned versions, and next to them, pages from the auditor's reports, small discrepancies circled in red pencil. He tapped the circles with one finger. "You were the signatory on each." The trick of interrogation is rhythm. They build pressure in increments, never enough to break you outright. I matched his pace with stillness, speaking only when necessary, using the same measured tone I'd used in committee briefings. "Clerical duplication," I said. "The ministry's requisition chain leaves a 48-hour delay between sign-off and posting. 2 signatures can overlap without conflict." It was true technically. Bureaucracy, my unintentional alibi. Kruger nodded, as if taking notes. "You see, that's the problem," he said. "The truth sounds like explanation, not confession." He left me alone in the room. No clock, no window, only the hum of the overhead bulb. Time lost its edges. Silence returned, not the safe kind, but the one that measures endurance. They held me for 48 hours exactly, the legal limit before charges required formalization. Realism was their cruelty, rules made pain respectable. Meals arrived irregularly, lukewarm and flavorless. I counted bites instead of hours. When sleep came, it was in fragments, like pages torn from a ledger. On the second night, Kruger returned, his jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened. "You're not a stupid man," he said. "If you were covering for someone, you'd tell us. If you were guilty, you'd show fear. But you don't. That makes you dangerous." "I'm tired," I said. "Not dangerous." He studied me for a moment, then slid a photograph across the table. My wife, standing outside our apartment with a suitcase. "She's been relocated for safety," he said. "Routine measure." His tone was casual, almost apologetic. I knew what safety meant. Reassignment, surveillance, control through absence. That was the moment the mask cracked, not mine, theirs. I saw it in his eyes: fatigue, doubt, maybe pity. He wasn't immune to the collapse. None of them were. They were trapped in the same machinery, obeying commands written by hands that no longer understood arithmetic. The flaw I'd warned about was no longer theoretical, it had devoured them too. When they released me, the city felt quieter, but not freer. I returned to my flat to find half my books gone and my correspondence sealed in government envelopes. On the kitchen table lay a single sheet, an inventory of confiscated items. At the bottom, someone had scrawled in pencil: "For State Review." I burned it in the sink. Paper burns faster than guilt, but it leaves more ash. Over the next weeks, The walls of the ministry tightened. Colleagues stopped meeting for coffee. Conversations ended mid-sentence when footsteps echoed in the hall. One morning, my assistant's desk was empty, no explanation, just the faint indent where her pen had rested. Silence had become the new uniform. I learned to match it. Each day I arrived precisely at 8, left precisely at 6, my reports immaculate, my posture composed. They mistook quiet for compliance, never realizing silence was the only language I still trusted. Every file I handled felt heavier, as if knowledge itself were a contraband material. The irony was mathematical. The more control they asserted, the less stable the structure became. Budgets collapsed under their own secrecy, contracts delayed, production targets missed. They blamed sabotage, foreigners, fate, anything but themselves. I didn't need to intervene anymore. The system was obeying the laws I'd written years ago. At night, I sat by the window, staring at the empty streetlights flickering in the fog. The silence that once protected me now pulsed like pressure under glass stillness before implosion. I waited, not with hope or dread, but with the calm of someone who has already measured the fall and knows exactly how far there is left to go. By April, Berlin no longer had a sky just smoke pressed down so low it felt like a ceiling. The city was unrecognizable. Streets that once carried parades now swallowed tanks whole. I was summoned to the bunker through corridors of concrete and fear, each checkpoint manned by boys too young to shave. Their eyes flickered like lamps on borrowed power. No one saluted anymore, gestures had lost their meaning. The air below was thick, metallic, sour with gasoline and panic. Radios hissed without words. Maps were pinned to the walls like autopsies of territory already dead. When I entered the main chamber, he was there, smaller than the legend, hair unwashed, eyes sharp but not focused, a man compressed into his myth. Who? His voice cracked like old wood. Who has done this? He meant the collapse, the empty treasury, the deserters, the trains that no longer arrived. Around him, generals stood like mannequins, faces drained of conviction. The only sound was the hum of the air vents, laboring to circulate what little oxygen remained. I didn't bow. Not defiance, just habit lost. The numbers did this, I said. He turned, trembling with fury that had nowhere to go. Numbers obey, he shouted. They serve the will. No, I said. They record it. A tremor ran through the bunker as another shell hit somewhere above. Dust drifted from the ceiling like gray snow. I opened my briefcase and drew out a single envelope, yellowed and sealed with an outdated departmental mark. The paper had softened over the years, edges worn from being handled but never delivered. I wrote this 12 years ago, I said, sliding it across the table. You signed the decree without the final authorization. The system began to fail that day. He didn't take it. Just stared, as if the seal itself accused him. I broke it open and laid the memo flat typed lines, dated March 1933, my signature at the bottom. Projected insolvency within 10 years if industrial capital remains under political control. Each figure was careful, verified, deadly. This, I said quietly, was your warning. He read the first lines, then the last, lips moving without sound. The room waited, the silence almost gentle now. His hand twitched toward his pistol, then stopped halfway. You, he whispered. You undermined everything. I recorded everything. I corrected. Your empire didn't collapse because of betrayal, it collapsed because it couldn't pay its own soldiers. The sentence hung in the air, clean and surgical. No need to raise my voice, the math was louder. He looked around the room, searching for loyalty and finding only fatigue. One general rubbed his temples. Another closed his eyes, as if hearing the verdict for the first time. Outside, the shelling drew nearer, a rhythm slower than heartbeats. You think history will spare you? He hissed. History doesn't spare anyone, I said. But it remembers. For a moment, he seemed smaller still, a man realizing that silence was stronger than command. He sank into his chair, breathing shallow, the color draining from his face. I gathered the memo, placed it back in the envelope, and left it on the table unanswered again, but this time by choice. As I turned to leave, he muttered something I almost didn't catch. It was perfect. It should have worked. It did, I said. For a while. In the corridor, the sound of the vents followed me, a low hum that blurred with the distant thunder of collapse. Each step upward felt heavier, as if gravity itself were tired. When I reached the exit ladder, I looked back once, the door to the chamber half open, the envelopes still visible under the flickering light. The empire had fallen into silence, and for the first time, it sounded honest. The first sound of peace wasn't music, it was paper. Thin ration sheets, provisional licenses, reconstruction drafts, sliding across scarred tables in makeshift offices. I remember the echo of typewriter keys in rooms without walls, where wind carried both dust and possibility. Berlin was a skeleton then, but one learning to stand. They called me back under the new flag, not as an accused, but as a reference. Continuity, one of the Allied officers said, isn't always corruption. I was assigned to the Banking Reconstruction Division, a name too clean for the work it demanded. Every ledger we opened was a confession, every vault unlocked carried the smell of smoke. Yet amid the ruin, I recognized something sacred: the chance to design with humility where arrogance had ruled. The process was deliberate, bureaucratic, almost devotional. 90 days to unfreeze industrial accounts, each file requiring signatures from 4 departments: Treasury, Trade, Reconstruction, and Allied Oversight. I spent evenings cross-checking factory claims, steel foundries requesting seed credit, textile mills pleading for machinery imports. I verified balances by hand, pen nibs scraping through the residue of ash that still clung to the paper. Progress was measured in patience, not power. There was a quiet satisfaction in that rhythm. Where once I'd hidden documents to protect the truth, now I cataloged them to rebuild it. Silence had changed meaning. It was no longer fear, but focus. In the gaps between meetings, I would step outside the ruins of the Reichsbank and listen, children shouting, hammers ringing, the soft thrum of trams returning to service. Life. Persistent and unsentimental. Sometimes, I found traces of the past, a name crossed out on a requisition form, an old cipher mark from my hidden ledgers. I would pause, thumb resting over the ink, remembering how secrecy once felt like survival. Now, transparency was its own rebellion. The difference between silence imposed and silence chosen was everything. Not everyone trusted me. One young officer asked, carefully, "How did you survive?" I told him the truth, that I had practiced restraint longer than anyone thought possible. He nodded, unsure whether to admire or fear that. Either response was fair. By the second year, the foundations began to hold. The currency stabilized, foreign credit trickled back, and for the first time, the numbers balanced without coercion. I took no satisfaction in vindication, only in structure restored. The empire had fallen through noise, and what replaced it was built in near silence, every calculation deliberate, every outcome earned. No revenge, only repair. That became my quiet oath. The men who'd ignored me were gone, but the lessons remained. Loyalty without literacy destroys, and power without process dissolves. Some evenings, I would walk home along the river where the bridges had been rebuilt from both sides at once. The water carried debris, yes, but also reflection, the city learning to see itself honestly. And I would think of that sealed memo, the one that survived every fire, now archived somewhere in a foreign vault. Proof not of defiance, but of discipline. What would you rebuild differently if you'd survived your own collapse? The question isn't about nations. It's about what silence can teach after the noise has burned away. The morning I signed my name again, the city was awake. Light slipped through the blinds like something newly permitted, and for a moment I just watched the dust move in its path. The final account lay open before me, serial number 4217B, restitution complete, every transaction verified. I wrote my signature slowly, each letter deliberate, not as a code or disguise this time, but as proof of return. The ink dried without hesitation. For 12 years, my identity had been an absence, a shadow between ledgers, a whisper behind false initials. But survival had always been arithmetic: stay small, stay precise, keep breathing. Now the balance was different. I wasn't hiding from history anymore, I was documenting it. The act was quiet, but it felt like the first breath after surfacing. Outside, the air was sharp and almost sweet. Construction hammers echoed across the river, not as threats but as testimony, sound reclaiming the space silence once guarded. I stepped into the sunlight, the chill pressing against my face, and it struck me how unfamiliar brightness could feel after years underground. What had been withheld was now deliberate, shaped, earned. Anonymity had kept me alive, but authorship would make the living matter. I'd already begun sorting my notes, the coded records, the sealed memo, all to be compiled when the world was steady enough to listen. Not revenge, not confession, but calibration. Truth, finally given form. I knew some would call it betrayal, others redemption. Both are versions of order trying to make sense of loss. To me, it was simple accounting, a closing entry in a long, unbalanced book. The columns now aligned. The silence reconciled. I wasn't his enemy. I was his proof. And someday, when the air is quiet again, not from fear, but from understanding, I'll publish what I kept. Not to accuse, but to remind, even in the loudest empires, it's the silent numbers that decide how the story ends.